I've known him since a long, long time ago, and I've been here a long time, and I guess we were both just kids, but he would come to the service on the other church over there and sit in the balcony and never make a move toward anything that I was doing and never make himself known. And then one day I found out, he says, I can't have high profile, but I'll call you at different times. And from Grenada, and from Iran, and from different places around the world, General Jerry Boykin, formerly of New Bern, a former running back with the Virginia Tech football people, team, would call me and say, preacher, pray. That's all he'd say. I said, don't ask you anything from around the world. And we knew. Now listen. Now I know some people will say, we're praying. Don't ever tell anybody that again unless you pray, okay? Because sometimes you're the one they're clinging to and you're the difference in their whole life. Don't tell everybody, I've been praying. And we say praying. I like what General Ashley wrote, the doctor. She said, I'm going down on my knees. And that's what we did. We went down on our knees to let him know that we were in the fight with him. And from Black Hawk down and from all these other things, we have General Jerry Boykin today. And I remember, I guess most vividly, when he had me out to his place, when he was the head of Delta Force, and he took me to the wall. And he said, this is one of my men right here that was dragged through Mogadishu, the streets. And we cried. And I said, I didn't know a big general like that could cry like that. He's gone on to do some great things and still doing them. He's executive vice president of the Family Educational Council right now. A great family thing. And still traveling around the world, and went to the very place in Israel that we were at in March when we went to the Valley of Tears, when we looked over and saw Syria. He's a teacher there, standing on the bunkers. I thought it was fitting to have him because he's such a wonderful man and such a great part of Fayetteville and such a great part of our church. And one of the great sons of the International Pentecostal Holiness Church, General Jerry Boykin. Would you make him welcome? Let's give him your great big, I love your hand. Come on. You can see them when you want to, okay?
Okay, God bless you. Please be seated. Well, it's good to be home. It's really good to be back here in Northwood Temple and back with friends. And I see so many old friends here, and the only one that I'm worried about is on the front row, and it's Jack Kelly. And you came here with an intent to mess me up, didn't you? Tell the truth. You did. I know you did. But he's old, so I forgive him. I've got a lot of friends in here. I've got a special friend in here, and there's two people in here that have really been my best friends. And one of them is obviously Larry Sessoms. The other one was Paul Ziesman. Where's Paul? Paul's sitting out there. He is. Stand up, Paul. Paul and Flo. Now, I want to tell you a story about Paul Ziesman there. He was over in the Delta Force with us, and he's probably the best communicator I've ever known in my life. I mean, this guy, it doesn't matter what it is, he can communicate. And he was one of the first people over there in the unit, and we were going on a little operation down on a Caribbean island called Grenada, and he came up to me, and I was a captain or lieutenant. I guess I was a major maybe. But he came up to me and he said, hey, give me your rucksack. I said, why do you want my rucksack? He said, I'm going to pack some radios in it. I said, you want me to carry the radios? I am a major. He said, give me the rucksack and just shut up. He brought me that thing back, and I'm telling you, that thing must have weighed 100 pounds. He stuffed all these radios in it. And then I went out and got on this Black Hawk, and we headed into Grenada. And on the way in, we got shot up bad, and I got hit with a .50 caliber. And let me tell you that the first thing I could think of was, I'm going to kill him when I get back. Well, the only thing that saved me, actually, was those radios, because it went through the radios. So when I got back, I said, Paul, I owe you. Brother, I owe you. He said, I told you not to sit in the smoking section. That was all he could say. How many of you in here today are Marines? We got a Marine here. We got one back here. All right, I want you guys, I want you to relax. There is not a big word in this presentation today, and you don't have to worry about anything. All right? It's really good to be home. Thank you, Pastor John, for inviting me back. And, you know, we're coming up on that period where we really do celebrate America. We celebrate the nation. There was a survey not too long ago. It was about 6 months ago. I believe it was George Barna, but I'm not sure. But there was a survey of millennials, and it said, how many of you are you proud to be an American? And 40% of them said no, they were not proud to be Americans. How can that be? How can that be that we are raising a generation of people that are not proud to be Americans? And let me tell you, my whole focus today is to you, be proud to be an American, because somebody has given you the right to be proud to be an American. There have been men and women that have paid a dear price for this nation, have paid a dear price that we might be able to be proud to be Americans. And many of them have given the last full measure, as it is frequently called. As a matter of fact, all you have to do is go to Arlington Cemetery or one of the national cemeteries here, and you walk down through there and you see that so many people have paid a dear price that we could be proud to be Americans. Let me tell you about a young boy named Cecil. He was born in 1926. In fact, he was born right here in North Carolina. He was born on a tobacco farm in Wilson County. And at the age of 17, 2 months after he turned 17, he slipped off to the recruiting station and joined the U.S. Navy because he already had four older brothers serving in the European theater. And he wanted to be part of it. He didn't want them to go off to war without him. And on the 6th of June, 1944, at 6:30 in the morning, just as the sun came up and the mist and the fog lifted on the beaches of Normandy, he was driving a landing craft coming ashore, and all of a sudden that landing craft was hit, and the next thing that he knew, he woke up in Bethesda Naval Hospital. They told him, Cecil, you are blind in your left eye, and you'll never regain sight of your left eye. He took a discharge, went back to the tobacco farm, and he married his high school sweetheart and started raising his family. The Korean War came along. The Army had a program that would allow disabled veterans to serve in the Army if they could still function, and Cecil rejoined the Army, and he went off to war again, and then he came home after that and went back to the tobacco farm until in 1954. The United States Marine Corps gave him an opportunity to go to work for the Marine Corps as a civil servant, and he spent 32 years with the Marine Corps. Cecil loved this country with a deep passion. You see, there was no such thing as taking a knee for Cecil. When that flag came anywhere near, he stood for that flag. He put his hand over his heart. When the national anthem was sung, he sang with them and put his hand over his heart. See, he loved America. He loved God, and he loved his country. He was a very thoughtful man. When his parents, who were sharecroppers, could no longer farm, they had 10 children, but only one of them accepted that it was his responsibility to take care of his parents, and he took his disability pension and he bought his parents a home that they lived in until they died. while he was living in a rented home with his family at the same time. When his friend's home burned down, he gave him all the money he had in his pockets because he thought it was his responsibility to take care of his neighbors. Because, see, he loved America. He loved God and he loved his family, and all he ever wanted was opportunity. He just wanted opportunity. Opportunity to serve. Opportunity to make something of himself, because he didn't have a high school education. And then when Cecil's children were all gone, off to college, out raising their own families, Cecil took in a little black boy. His name was Shakif, and in that area where Cecil lived, you didn't do that. And people would say, "Cecil, what's the matter with you? Can't you see that boy's black?" And I, without repeating exactly what he said, he let them know that it was none of their business what he did, because he believed that the worst thing that could happen was for a boy to grow up without a father. See, Cecil loved America, Cecil loved God, and Cecil loved his family. He loved baseball, he loved to hunt and fish, but he was such a baseball fanatic, he coached all the baseball teams, and they called him Mr. Baseball. And finally, before Cecil died, they named the local baseball field after Cecil, the high school field. They named it the Gerald Cecil Boykin baseball field. I know you saw it coming. It was my dad. And I had no choice but to grow up. Loving this country. Because I watched him. He loved America. It grieves me that we have a large sector of our population that does not love this country, that is not proud to be Americans, and we need to change that. You are all here today. You love America, but we need to understand that we've got to do all we can to preserve this nation and the freedoms, the liberties that our founding fathers gave us. You see, Cecil took an oath. 3 separate times he took an oath. He took an oath to this right here. This is a Constitution of the United States. I carry this in my pocket. My wife Ashley gave me this Constitution. And I can't read to you what she wrote in it, but, and trust me, it's just because I get emotional when I do. But Cecil took an oath to this Constitution, the same oath that every service member in here took. It said, "I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And I'll bear true faith and allegiance to the same." That's a sacred oath. Do you understand? That's a sacred oath. Don't ever violate it. An oath, and by the way, for all you that served in our military, you need to remember that there is no expiration date on that oath that you took. You continue to serve this country. And now we celebrate the birth of America, and one of the problems that we have is that we've lost our history. We've forgotten our history. We don't teach our history anymore, and that is so fundamental. There's an old proverb that says, if you dwell in the past, you lose an eye. If you forget about the past, you lose both eyes. Are we as a nation forgetting our past? I don't know how many of you have ever watched Jesse Waters. He's with Fox News, but he goes out on the streets and he goes along and asks people questions. Like, who was the first president? Oh, man. Oh, yeah, Jimmy Carter. And we laugh. Yeah, it's funny. Who won the Civil War? Oh, man, who was fighting? Who was? Stuff that, I knew in the first grade. But we don't teach our history anymore. Therefore, we're losing our identity because we don't know where we came from. We don't know. The most important thing is we don't know what price was paid for America. We don't know the cost. You see, this nation was bought in blood. And now we have a generation that's coming along because we don't teach history the way we should, that is not aware of that cost, of that history of sacrifice. And most of them don't know what's in this Constitution. Most of them don't know what the what's in the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of this Constitution. Most people in this country don't know what their freedoms are. And that's sad. Let's go back in time. Let's look at the 56 men that assembled in Philadelphia on the 2nd of July, 1776. We celebrated on the 4th of July, but it was the 2nd of July when they did the most important thing, and that was they took the vote. They voted to separate from the Crown of England, the most powerful, certainly the most powerful military in the world, and probably the most powerful nation at that time. And here were these rag-bag 13 colonies on the continent of what became North America that were shaking their fist at King George. And these 56 men came in and they cast their votes to separate from the Crown of England. I invite you to read the story of the guy that actually cast the deciding vote, and his name was Caesar Rodney. He was a representative from Delaware. He was a sickly man. He had missed the first vote. This was not the first vote. He had missed the first vote because he was dying of cancer, and he had a really bad case of pneumonia. But Caesar Rodney was called. Caesar, can you be here? The only way we can separate is for you to come and vote, because you will be the deciding vote. Caesar Rodney rode from Delaware to Philadelphia through the night in a driving rainstorm and cast the deciding vote because he was so committed to this concept of liberty. Our founding fathers were men of incredible courage. Caesar Rodney was frail and sickly, and he died only a short time afterwards. But these 56 men, were bound together by two things. One was a common belief in individual liberties, and the other was a common faith. And I don't care what the revisionist historians might say, and you see it all the time. There's a book, a really good read. It's called His Excellency George Washington. But the author of that book says in there, he was not a very religious man. Well, we're going to come back to that in just a minute. All of these men were of the Christian faith. They did not agree on theology. They were not all of the same denomination, but they agreed in the divinity of Jesus Christ. They were men of the Christian faith. And then they came together and they wrote this declaration. And you all have heard the story of, in the very last paragraph of the declaration, as these 56 men knew that they were putting a big target on their own chest. They knew that if they lost this revolution, they were going to be executed as traitors to the Crown of England. And they were going up against the most powerful military in the world at that time, the British Army. But they finished that declaration with this phrase: "And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of Providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." Some of those men lost their lives fighting in that revolution. Many of them lost their fortunes. They lost everything they had. I'll tell you a couple of vignettes on this here in a second. But none of them ever lost their sacred honor. None of them ever turned back. None of them ever renounced what they had done in Philadelphia on the 2nd of July. None of them. Because they were men of courage and they were men of honor. And we need to tell this generation who these founding fathers were. We need to perpetuate a real story of who these 56 men were. And then later, who the men were that signed the Declaration of Independence. But when they took that vote and signed that document, they set the stage for two things. The first one was war. And the second one was ultimately freedom. We had to fight a 7-year war. We won our independence from Britain, especially in the last battle there, when we had Cornwallis hemmed up at Yorktown. And we knew that this was the time to deal a lethal blow to Cornwallis and his argument. I'll come back to that in a minute because there's a story that I want to tell you about that. But God's hand was upon us Do you realize George Washington lost more battles than he won? Do you realize that? He lost more battles than he won, but God's hand was upon him. God gave birth. He breathed life into this new nation. No matter what the revisionist historians say, we were created by the hand of God because Washington couldn't win. He could not beat the British on the battlefield. But he did. You know what? One of the most famous paintings that reflects on the Revolution is the painting of George Washington praying at Valley Forge. You ever see it? I have 2 copies of it, actually, down next to his horse, praying at Valley Forge, and the revisionist historians say, no, that was not true. He didn't really do that. Because they're trying to denigrate the history, the true history of George Washington. But you know, we do know it was true because there was an eyewitness there, and I want to read you this eyewitness, and this is what's so interesting about it. This eyewitness was a Quaker. He was a Tory. He was against the war. He and his wife has spoken eloquently about how they opposed the American Revolution. And in that winter, when things looked almost hopeless, this guy named Potts was riding his horse along the edge of the woods. And this is what he said, and part of what he said in his eyewitness testimony. I tied my horse to a sapling and went quietly into the woods. And to my astonishment, I saw the great George Washington on his knees, alone. He was at prayer to the God of the armies, beseeching to interpose with his divine aid, as it was ye crisis and the cause of the country, of humanity, and of the world. Such a prayer I never heard from the lips of man. I left him alone praying. He went home, and this is what he says about when he went home. Remember, he was a Tory. He opposed the war. He said, I went home and told my wife, I saw a sight today that is never heard. What I never saw or heard before, and just related to her, and what I had seen and heard and observed. We never thought a man could be a soldier and a Christian. But if there is one in the world, it is George Washington. And then he goes on to say, and at that moment we became Whigs and supported the American Revolution. Now, we got a lot of soldiers in here. We got a lot of sailors, airmen, Marines. We got a lot of people in here. Look, let me tell you, I had to reconcile this issue a long time ago about whether you can be a soldier and be a Christian at the same time. And people ask me that. They've asked me that for the last 6 years. How can you be a Christian and be a soldier? I said, what do you mean? They said, well, the Bible says thou shalt not kill. Pastor, is that what the Bible says? It says thou shalt not murder. Thou shalt not murder. And it's a different concept than thou shalt not kill. And if you believe that God really said thou shalt not kill, then you got to believe that he changed his mind somewhere between Mount Sinai and the Jordan River, because when he got to the Jordan River and Joshua was about to lead the people across the river, what did he say? He said, kill them all. I just read a story yesterday about an Assemblies of God pastor, I think it was in Missouri, that came up on somebody that was carjacking people, and he shot 1 or 2 of them already. And this Assemblies of God pastor got out, grabbed his gun, and went over and killed the guy. Now, we need to find that guy and send him a letter and tell him he done good. Because this is an issue that every man and woman needs to come to grips with. But they changed their mind about the war when they saw George Washington there praying at Valley Forge. And it's an incredible story. It's an incredible painting, but it reflects on how important prayer was, how important the hand of God was upon the founding of this nation. Isaiah 6:8 says, also I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send? And who will go for us? Then said I, here am I, send me. And Paul and I have seen more than one of our friends, our comrades that have lost their lives in service to this country. But they stepped forward willingly and they said, here am I, send me. You see, America was bought in blood and America was preserved in blood, and America will in the future be preserved by the blood of our young men and women that step forward and say, here am I, send me. And it's not just on the battlefield. We've got to take a stand against what's happening in our country. When you see things you know are wrong, when you see things that are evil, we've got to take a stand against those things. We've got to rise up like a mighty army. The Bible says in Psalms 7:9 says, if you won't take a stand or you won't take a position for your faith, in other words, if you won't stand for your faith, you won't stand at all. But the Bible also says in Psalm 94, who will take a stand against these evildoers for me? Who will rise up against these doers of iniquity? And when you see that in your community, you've got to rise up against. You've got to stand against. When they start telling you they want to teach pornographic sex education to kindergartners, you got to go to that school board. You got to be counted. You got to go to the school board and say, no, you're not going to do that in my community. We got to stand up against this stuff. I was just with a woman in Charlotte Wednesday of this week, and she's the woman, if you've ever read anything about it in the paper, that did exactly that. She went down to the school board and she said, you're not teaching that pornographic stuff to my children. She's got 10 children. And she rallied a group of people, and they shut it down. That's what we got to do. We got to rise up against evil. You know, our founding fathers that gave us this country certainly had an expectation that we would defend and preserve the country that they'd given us. And remember that the signing of that declaration was only the beginning. It was only the first step, because then they had to write a constitution. In 1787, they reassembled in Philadelphia, and they wrote this constitution. And you know the story of, and it's true, of Ben Franklin in early September, after a long hot summer of writing this constitution. He stepped out in the street, and a woman approached him and said, tell me, Mr. Franklin, what kind of government have you given us? And he said, a republic, madam, if you can keep it. If you can keep, was that wisdom? Did he have a gift of prophecy? A republic, madam, if you can keep it. George Washington and Benjamin Franklin and all the other founding fathers expected that the next generations would perpetuate and carry on and defend with their lives, if necessary, this nation that they had given us. There's been such a sacrifice for this country. We have the right to be proud to be Americans. And remember this, the Constitution is an extension of the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration was just the first phase. The Constitution was the continuation of that. And the Bill of Rights was the next phase of it. You can't separate the Constitution from the Declaration of Independence. Well, who were these men? All 56 were the men of the Christian faith. They were men of great courage, and they were men that were willing to risk it all for something they believed in. 29 of them were from colleges that taught theology. 24 were judges or lawyers. 11 were merchants. 9 were big landowners. And when I say big landowners, some of the biggest landowners in the country. And you know, the American Revolution is unlike any other revolution in history in that it started with the most wealthy elite. It didn't start at the bottom with the peasants who ultimately rose up against their own. It started with the most elite. And all of these 56 men that signed that declaration were part of this elite. Big landowners, 9 of them, and 12 of them were doctors. ministers or politicians, but they were bound together by this idea and this vision of true freedom. What price did they pay? This is a history we need to teach the next generation. And we're failing. Folks, I'm talking to all of you in the church today. If we're not perpetuating this through our grandchildren and helping teach them of the price that's been paid in America, we're missing what we're supposed to be doing. We're failing at what we're supposed to be doing. It's our job to perpetuate this. Many of them lost everything they had and they died in poverty. One example is the price paid by a guy named John Hart of New Jersey, one of those men that signed that declaration. He tried to sneak home from the front, from the battlefront, to see his ailing wife, who he had been told was in very critical condition. And the Hessians interdicted him and gave chase, and he ran back into the mountains and wound up living in caves until the war was over with. And eventually he sneaked home and found that his wife had been buried, and all 13 of his children were gone, and he never saw them again. He died as a pauper. Think of that. The price that he paid, 13 children he never saw again, and he lost his wife. It's incredible. And then another example of the price that was paid was Judge Richard Stockton. He returned home from the battlefront to try and evacuate his family, get them away from the redcoats. But he was betrayed by one of the Tories, and the redcoats captured him, and they put him in prison, and when they put him in prison, they starved him and they beat him. And he was finally released as an invalid after the war. He returned to a looted estate, and he and his family lived off of charity for the rest of their lives. Think about it. He paid quite a price, didn't he? We have the right to be proud because there's been a price paid for America. We have the right to be proud. And then Thomas Nelson, one of the largest landowners in the 13 colonies. He lived down on what became the Yorktown battlefield, and Lord Cornwallis had taken was described by eyewitnesses as a large and beautiful home down on the York River there. And Cornwallis made it his headquarters, and George Washington refused to fire on it because it belonged to Thomas Nelson. Nelson went to George Washington and said, "Level it. Level it. We have to win." They leveled his home. Thomas Nelson died as a pauper. Our lives, our fortunes, our sacred honor, they never lost their honor. These men fought for an idea. They had a transcendent cause. That transcendent cause was an idea of freedom. An idea of freedom. And then they came back in 1787 to write the Constitution, later to write the Bill of Rights. And once they'd written the Constitution, Ben Franklin also said, "We have surveyed all forms of government and found none suitable for this new nation." They were not just talking about suitable, they all, at the time, the current forms of government, they were talking about historically. They had looked at all these different types of government and found none suitable. They created a republic for us. Many people say a democracy. It's actually a republic. But they found none acceptable, so they created their own because they were driven by the Holy Spirit, in my view. And they gave us, when they came back to assemble to write the first 10 amendments, they gave us the First Amendment. What do you think? What's the First Amendment? What does it say? Congress shall make no laws respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, to petition their government for the redress of grievances. That is 5 constitutional freedoms and 1 amendment, and that was the First Amendment. And what they said was, you have freedom of religion. Folks, I'm going to tell you right now, there are There are evil elements in our society today that want us to accept freedom of worship, and that is not what our founding fathers intended. What they intended was you can believe what you want to believe, but you can also live it. You can take it in the public square. See, that's what Hitler did. He said to the church in Germany, and by the way, the church in Germany was very robust. Going into World War II, people had come, after World War I, people had been so devastated. They were searching for answers, and they were searching for God. But Hitler said, you can worship, but don't you bring it in the public square or I'll crush you. And the only guy that really stood up against Hitler was a man that paid with his life. You all know who it was. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was executed because he stood up to Hitler. And then less than 100 years later, we had to fight a civil war to make sure that all men are created equal was a statement that we really believed. Because the church rose up. The church rose up across the Appalachian Mountains in what we know as the Second Great Awakening. The church began to say, you cannot believe the words in this Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and still hold the black man a slave. And it brought about the Civil War and ultimately an end to slavery. We have a right to be proud to be Americans. You know, America is the first to be called. Every time, we're the first to be called. When something happens around the world, we're the ones they call for. I remember back in 1995, everything exploded in the Balkans. And the British and the French and the Germans said, we got this one. This is on our continent. We got it. And they went in. They were going to handle this as the factions were fighting in the Balkans. And pretty soon, within less than 3 months, they came back to us and said, you Americans, we've let you have control of NATO for the last 40 years. Now it's time for you to step up and take the leadership. Because they couldn't do it. It takes American leadership to do a lot of these things. And that American flag strikes fear in the hearts of some and brings great hope to others. And if you think of the 6th of June, just 2 weeks ago, we celebrated D-Day. And last September, I walked the beaches of Normandy. And as I walked the beaches of Normandy, and I just finished reading a book, The Dead and Those Who Will Die. It was about the 1st Infantry Division on D-Day that were slaughtered. 10,000 casualties just in that first day, the beaches of Normandy. And I walked that beach and I reflected on that guy driving that landing craft that morning. My dad. It occurred to me. He didn't come over here to get wounded. He didn't come over here to die. But he came here because he had a transcendent cause, and that was he believed in the same things our founding fathers believed in. And he spent his life committed to those things. As we came across those beaches and the people in France began to rejoice, what were they rejoicing? It wasn't the artillery. It wasn't the M1 carbines. It was the American flag that they brought across that beach that day because America's here. You want to see something that will warm your heart? Go back to the Gulf War and watch the videos on YouTube of when the American forces came rolling into Kuwait City as we liberated Kuwait City. They were jumping and shouting in the streets, but you know why? Because on top of those armored personnel carriers and Humvees, there was an American flag flying. We have the right to be proud to be Americans. Let me tell you, my best Christmas Eve, and Paul was there, was in Panama. 1989, Christmas Eve. It was then, Christmas Eve, about 3:50 in the afternoon, that we finally ran Noriega, who we were chasing, the evil despot ruler there, demon worshiper. We ran him into the Vatican embassy. He had no place else to go. We had taken everything. We'd hit every safe house. He had nothing, no place to go. And he went in and took refuge with the papal nuncio, or the Vatican ambassador. And we surrounded that place very, very quickly. That was Christmas Eve. In just a matter of a couple of hours, we had concertina wire all the way around that place, and you could not get in there, nor could he get out. We had guards on watch, and I walked that perimeter on Christmas Eve. And as I walked that perimeter, Panamanians were coming up to me and saying, with tears in their eyes, thank you. Thank you for giving us our country back. Thank you. Please come to my home and call your family. It's Christmas Eve. Please, here's some food. Please enjoy these cookies, this cake. It's the best Christmas I spent. And all I could think was what Ben Franklin said. A republic, madam, if you can keep it. And that's what I was thinking when she said, thanks for giving us our country back. I was thinking, we've given it back to you. Now, can you keep it? Can you keep it? That's what's important. And then finally, I just want to finish my presentation here with this. And I will be, I have to get to the airport, but I do have some of my books, The Warrior Soul, which I wrote with Stu Weber, who has spoken right here with you. He's a Vietnam veteran, Green Beret. It's a good book. And then for those of you who have not had my autobiography, Never Surrender, they'll be right here. I've signed them all already. My wife will be out there. Don't any of you Marines be hitting on my wife. Any questions on that? And I got spies in this church that will tell me, too, if you have been. She's beautiful. Stand up. I just want you to see my wife. Come on, stand up here. Stand up. Isn't she beautiful? Yeah. Yeah. I tell you what, she still makes my pity pat go heart, heart. She really does. Well, when I told you I'd been hit with that .50 caliber and Paul Ziesman set me up there, I was this close to bleeding out. I had lost so much blood, but they brought me back to Womack, and this was the old Womack over here, and they, first of all, when I got hit, they evacuated me out to an aircraft carrier. It's actually one of those Marine amphib carriers, the USS Guam, and they operated on me, and then they put me on a plane, and they brought me back to Fort Bragg here, and they took me right into surgery. When I came out of surgery, I couldn't use my left arm, and John Hedgepeth, I don't know if you remember, John, but you prayed for me right there in that aisle, right there in this church. You prayed for me. One Sunday night, you laid your hands on me and prayed for me. And I was messed up bad, and I had no use of my arm whatsoever. The bone in it was shot completely in two, and the nerve was shot completely in two. And when I woke up, and they put me in surgery there in Womack. And what is that room I woke up in? It's the delivery room. That's not right. What's the other one? Yeah, thank you. I said delivery room a couple of times. I got a brain lock on that, but I woke up and there was a medical team around me, and this is what the medical team said. They said, "Sir, you've got a very serious injury." I thought, really? No kidding. I've been hitting the side, right up through the side of my chest and right up through my armpit. Again, the only thing that saved me, other than the hand of God, was the fact that I had all them radios in that rucksack, because they went through the radio first. And they said, "Sir, you got a serious injury." And I said, "Yeah, I know." They said, "We need to take your arm off." I said, "Okay, what was plan B now?" And they said, "No, sir, you don't understand." They said, the bone in your arm is shot completely in two, but the problem is the nerve is shot in two, and the nerve will not regenerate. This is 1983, said the nerve won't regenerate. So we need to take your arm off. It'll reduce the chance of infection. And I looked at him, I said, "You just do the best you can, because you ain't taking my arm off." I said, my God's going to heal me. And they said, well, you certainly have a good attitude. But look, I was feeling really bad. I was feeling sorry for myself. And they took me back and laid me in that bed in the hospital there at Womack, and I was just feeling, God, why? God, why? Why, God? I'm going to go through the rest of my life without being able to use this arm. Why, God? And CNN International was down on the island of Grenada, and I don't know if you realize it, but CNN was not a big friend of Ronald Reagan. And they were looking for somebody to criticize Ronald Reagan. This was 2 days after the invasion. They were going along looking for somebody who would say something. They said, who here wants to say something about this? And this old Grenadian lady said, I do. And I'm laying in the hospital at Womack, and I'm looking up at the television, and I'm watching this. And they walked over to her, and the commentator said, well, ma'am, what do you think of America invading your homeland? And she said, oh, I got something to say about that. And I remember this old Grenadian woman, she only had one tooth, and it was right there. But she was beautiful. She had a big smile. And she took that, she actually pulled the thing out of the guy's hand. She said, oh, I got something to say. And you could just tell, he was so excited. She was going to criticize Ronald Reagan. And she said, I got something to say. Yes, yes. God bless Ronald Reagan, and God bless America. Well, God bless America, folks.
Be ready. Come on, a great hand to one of the great patriots.